Welcome everybody. My name is Willemien Ott and I'm one of the two faculty co-directors of the Marty Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all. One of the first events after we've been back from COVID and the first week of the quarter to this event today, chaired by Bree Lascoda, who you all know, so I'm not going to introduce anymore. But Bree is the executive director of the Marty Center, and Liz Bucar. And Liz, I will introduce. She's professor of religion, Dean's Leadership Fellow, and Director of Sacred Rites at Northeastern University. Liz is an expert in comparative religious ethics, and she's a sought-after lecturer on topics ranging from gender reassignment surgery to the global politics of modest clothing. She's the author of 4 books and 2 edited collections, including the award-winning trade book, Pious Fashion, How Muslim Women Dress, Harvard 2017, and Stealing My Religion, Not Just Any Cultural Appropriation, Harvard, coming out in the summer of 2022. Bucar's public scholarship includes bylines in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, and Teen Vogue, as well as several radio and podcast interviews. She has a PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago's Divinity School from our own Professor William Schweiker. And I should also say as a teaser for this event that Liz is here today, but she's coming back in September. And you'll hear more about that in the course of the interview. Welcome.
So thanks for coming, and thanks for spending the evening and the day with us. Yeah. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to Swift Hall. Yes. And I want to start by understanding what brought you to the Divinity School in the first place.
Yeah, so I think I was a little bit of a reluctant scholar of religious studies in general, I would say, if that's fair to say. So I'm not someone who had religion as an undergrad. Actually, Sarah, how much time we were talking about this today when we met, that this is the first class I ever had in religion, was in Swift Hall. I came from like an activist background. I came from DC. I was working at NGOs, and I was interested in reproductive health, and so religion was like in the room all the time. And so when I came here, at the time I actually applied to public health programs, law programs, and religion programs, and I just came for the master's. My full intention was to like drop out and go, I don't know, not looking at my advisor in the audience, I don't know if you do this, but my full intention was to go to law school. I deferred law school. And then they called me my second year here, and I was like, no, like this is really the place I decided I wanted to be a scholar of religious studies. I like fell in love with the study of religion. But I was a little bit reluctant in the beginning, I would say. Yeah.
And so what was your time like here?
I'm one of those people who really liked my time here. I almost feel like embarrassed saying that. I feel like you're supposed to like feel like this was like a arduous thing to get through. But I think because I came in thinking, well, I always have this NGO work. If this scholar gig doesn't work out, I could really just focus on what I wanted to focus on. I learned, we had a really big cohort at the time. I learned a ton from them. I mean, we had just had tons of students here, well, obviously from the faculty as well, but it was like a new thing for me. I don't come from an academic family. I never saw myself as a scholar or a professor, so I had to like learn a new language, learn new research skills. It was really kind of like, okay, this is a new world for me. How do I jump in? But I mean, I think also I was thinking back about being here makes me think about what it was like to first get here. And I was a little bit, I would say I was a little bit uncomfortable my first year trying to figure out where I fit into like the different categories we had here. At the time, I'm sure this is not true anymore, but the big tension was between history, religion, and constructive studies. And I didn't quite know how to fit into either one of those. I didn't want to be a Catholic moral theologian. I wasn't confessional in my interest in ethics, but I was interested in constructive stuff. And actually, Rick Rosengarten is the one who sat me down. He was dean of students at the time, and he's like, no, it's okay. You sit on the border, and that's all right. Like that can be a productive place to be. And I think once he told me that, I was like, okay. And then they named this. There was this thing named comparative religious ethics, but it took me a while to figure that out. And then once I knew that, I was like, okay, I'm ready. Yeah, I feel comfortable. I can figure out where my spot is here, my place is here.
And so when you left, what was the trajectory of your career like? Because it didn't start with public scholarship.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, Again, I loved my time here. I learned a ton, but I didn't learn how to be a public scholar here. I learned how to do, really careful research and how to write an academic register for academic study audiences. And I did that. I had tenure-track jobs at research institutions. I still write mostly university press books and peer-reviewed articles, and that's what I did through tenure, through promotion to full, and quite frankly avoided any public scholarship. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't answer the phone if a reporter called me, and they sometimes called me because I worked on Iran, so I could talk about Iran. Then I started working on Muslim women. Everyone cares about veiling, and I was like, that just seems really risky. And frankly, I don't need to do it because I was told Chicago I didn't have to do it. So I see models where I don't have to do it and have a career. But also, no one cares about that for tenure. No one's telling me I have to do that for tenure. No one's telling me I have to do that to be promoted through the rank. And so, yeah, no, it wasn't part of my career early on. And that's not everyone's trajectory. I would say there are people on my leadership team for Sacred Rights now who would say that was because of who I was. As a white woman in studying traditions of what I'm not even part of, I had distance and could sort of do that, where some scholars are always felt to be accountable to the communities that they're studying in a different way. And I think I didn't feel that early on. So I was just sort of really focused on doing what I needed to do, really practical. What do I need to do to march myself through the career I think I'm supposed to have. Yeah.
So what changed? Right, because something
Yeah,
must have
something
changed
changed, yeah.
for you to be so well known for your public scholarship in addition to your traditional scholarship.
Yeah, so I think partly it was being tenured and having more space to think about. I can say to vocation because we're in the div school. Really, why did I come to the study of religion? That's part of it. Part of it was the 2016 election. And then being I love studying religion when I'm here. I did the things I'm supposed to do. I'm almost a full professor at this time. So what's next? What else can I do? Who else can I speak to? This is an extension of my teaching, right? This is not. I didn't get into it. I don't want to be on MSNBC. I don't want to have. I don't want to have a brand. I don't really want to be famous.
You don't want to be a pundit.
Yeah, right. I'm not good at that either. I'm not. I don't have I don't have the manner. Yeah, I just don't have the personality for that. But also, I did want to talk to people who I wasn't talking to. I have I only 25 kids in my class, or two big sections. I maybe have 50 in a semester. But what other conversations could I be part of if religion is so important? And so deciding that was something I wanted to do, and then the next step is okay, I don't actually know how to do that, which it's just because it's a different set of skills, right? It's partly it's a translation thing, partly it's learning how to write a new way. So I feel very much the last couple of years have been thinking about writing the way I think about writing in college, almost the art of writing, the craft of writing to communicate versus writing to think. I learned how to write. Not everyone is this way, but I'm a person who thinks through their writing. So when I write and revise, that's how I figure out what's going on. But doing that, but then thinking about writing as a way to communicate with other people and bring them into a conversation. So it was really thinking about writing in a different way and thinking about who do I want to talk to? I want. We called Pious Fashion a trade book, which probably Harvard wouldn't like to say. It's a crossover trade book, but it is more tradey. And when I wrote that, I was my mom's women's study group in her conservative Lutheran church in Pennsylvania read that book. They didn't read my first book, right? And they had, and I went down and talked to these 20 very nice church ladies who had only heard pretty crazy stereotypes about Islam in general and gender. That was but it was about clothing, so it was an entry into really a public teaching moment. Or the Teen Vogue thing. People always sort of kind of smile when they hear I've written for Teen Vogue, but I have a 13-year-old daughter who is extremely woke, but she doesn't understand. She's woke in this sort of secular liberal way, right? She doesn't understand religious minority, the way in which gender and politics and sex. I wanted to write for that audience. So Teen Vogue is where that audience was in 2017. So figure out how do I write for that audience? How do I meet them where they are? How can I have a teaching moment with them?
Kristen Dumaze was here in the fall, and she talked about writing her book as struggling to capture the attention of every reader's eye from the beginning of the paragraph to the end.
Oh, see,
and
that's beautiful.
And I thought that was a really interesting way to
Yeah,
think about
yeah.
what it meant to write for that audience, that she was fighting for their attention and she knew she had to keep it at every moment, otherwise it would get lost, right? Otherwise the idea would get lost or it wouldn't make the transition that she was hoping it would make.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it, because I think that when I wrote my first book for University Press, right? I don't care about the audience. Like, I was going to write a University Press book, and someone in graduate school was probably going to teach it if it was like smart enough or cutting edge enough. But like, it wasn't about the audience per se. It was about my intellectual walk through this stuff, versus putting it back on the audience. It's not about like dumbing it down, but it's not like dumbing it down for my mom, but it's more like thinking about what are the questions that she would bring to the material. And now how do I like respect the audience in such a way that like I spend time on the paragraph level to keep them engaged, which is, I mean, I rewrote this last book that's coming out this summer. I think I rewrote it 5 times during COVID. I just kept rewriting it, trying to get the right like tone to it. And it's like, it's a learning process for me. I mean, she's a great writer. Yeah, and so, like trying to like figure out how to do that is sort of, it's part of the process.
I also don't think you're selling people on the idea that public scholarship's a great way to go if you have to rewrite every book 5 times.
Well, that was COVID too. I mean, like, it was just like, this is a book that was written between 5 o'clock and like 7:30 when the kid was being homeschooled, kind of thing, and rewritten. No, and I don't think it's just writing. For me, a lot of it has been writing, because that was what came to, so when Pious Fashion was published, my Harvard Press really pushed it out into the world, and suddenly the Washington Post reviewed it, and Times Literary, TLC, Times Literary Supplements, yes, thank you, reviewed it, and I was like, whoa, okay, and then people wanted to talk to me on radio, and people wanted me to write op-eds, and I didn't know how to do that, and so when people asked me to write op-ed, I had to figure out how to write an op-ed, but so a lot of it was figuring out how to write a new way, but I think that's only one model of public scholarship. I don't want to like say that that's the only thing that people have to do too. It doesn't have to be trade books and op-eds. It's really about figuring out, again, it's back to that vocation question, like, who is it that I want to reach? How do I reach them? What do I feel comfortable in? Do I feel comfortable on a podcast? Do I want to be on MSNBC? Do I want to be a YouTuber? I mean, or do I want to just be thinking about community partners, or, there's lots of ways of thinking about it. For me, it's just the stuff that's not my day job, the stuff that's not my students and not my formal academic writing.
So how do you think about, can you define for us the terrain of public scholarship? What is it that you think of when, because it's a lot of not that, right?
Yeah.
But what's the this that it is?
So I think that when people hear, or when I first heard it, I was thinking it's like trade books and op-eds, right? Or it's like trade books and it's like, or not trade books, it's op-eds and like anytime you can get yourself on TV. Those things are included, but I also think for me, it's really about, again, thinking about the way that I focused my thinking and writing and communicating, and so peer-reviewed articles and university press books that are only going to have 500 or 1,000 run, and a peer-reviewed article that's, I don't know how many. My Google citation is like not great. My Google citation numbers are like, not amazing for that stuff, even though I think that stuff is really smart. So if I want to reach other people, what are the other ways to do that? So I think it's kind of like everything outside of that. So sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's partnering, sometimes it's like an open source syllabus that's like online. Sometimes it's being engaged in social media. For me, it's been a lot of like relationship building with journalists and editors, which everything's relationships, right, I guess is true, but I didn't realize that as I was entering that it was going to be really important that like Robin Given of the Washington Post reviewed Pious Fashion when she was the fashion reporter, and then she's like now the cultural critic for the Washington Post. So when COVID hits and people wear face masks, she like calls me and I'm like, I like don't work on face masks. This is like not a hijab. But wait a minute, but we're friends. Let's talk about this for 45 minutes. And then she writes a great article about how, which I do think is true, and which I told her, and I'm like quoting this article about telling with this, but like I do think the way in which we approach masking in front of each other, it changes who we are, right? And that's virtue ethics, basically. Like if I tell my 13-year-old to put on her mask because I don't want you to get sick, it's really important, versus if I tell her to put on her mask because our neighbors are 75 and we're worried about them, that's a different way to like be in the world. And so here's an ethical lesson you can put in your thing, which is not really about the content of my research. But yes, it is about the content of my research, and that's only possible because of a relationship I had with her over the years. So for me, it's a lot of just like sometimes just getting on the phone to shape a story that I don't want to be quoted in because I don't want my social media maybe to blow up, but like getting people to ask the right questions and then connecting them to the right people, that's actually been probably most of what I do. You don't see that. Like I don't put that on my website, and it's not on my CV, but that's probably where I've been the most effective.
That taking that call from a journalist about a subject
Yeah.
that you wouldn't necessarily say,
Yeah.
this is my area of expertise, but
Yeah.
rather this is where I have some insight to shape and guide your story. That's not a habit.
No.
It's not a
Yeah.
practice that people have. It's not a
Yeah.
habit that they have. It's also not always very comfortable.
It's super uncomfortable.
So how do
Yeah.
you navigate that?
So we spend a lot of time in sacred rights now. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But
Yeah.
also, I think I started thinking about this through an op-ed project training, thinking about your credibility and thinking about, the word expertise is a little bit problematic for some people, right? Because it's who's authorizing the expertise. It seems sort of like about institutions outside authorization. And yet, I feel like I spent a lot of time here, literally, studying stuff and thinking about stuff and writing about stuff. And then I've had the privilege of having a career, when I graduated, 2006, for a long time, was that 15 years, of where I just do that all the time. So I do know some stuff. And so thinking about how to make myself credible to different people by talking about the ways in which I know things. So that's like a translation issue, but also how do I broaden what I know so I can be parts of bigger conversations? Like, it's not that I just like know about like the intersection of politics and aesthetics because I study hijab, but I also, again, think about like what does it mean to wear clothing? What does it mean to wear a face mask in terms of like ethical formation, right? So partly it's broadening your expertise, and that comes from practice, right? Thinking about this is what I know my dissertation. These are the things that come out of it. These are things I feel comfortable talking about. And then a lot of that too, like I think I only went in that conversation with Robin because I knew her and trusted her, and I was like, okay, we can play with this idea for a while. I mean, I wouldn't just pick up the phone and be like, with anybody and start like, let's brainstorm about hijab and face masks. I mean, it just sounds like something to get myself in trouble about, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a skill. I think it's. I think we're taught to do this in our training, right? And that's important. Like, none of this is like. The public scholarship for me that I do anything I do that's public facing is only because I've done all this first, right? And I still do 80% of my time like this. I haven't really done any public. That's actually not true. I wrote a couple op-eds in the fall, but in general, I haven't done any public facing work in the last couple of years because I've been really focused. But now that I've like thought through and written this book, I now want to think about who I can like now be in conversation with about it.
Right.
Yeah.
I was at an event, and it was a Hollywood sort of event, and somebody was talking about telling universal versus telling particular stories.
Yeah.
And he said the only way that you can tell a universal story is through a particular narrative. And I thought it was a really interesting sort of analogy to the only way that you have something to say that is broader is if you can be deep.
Yeah.
But if you know something deep enough,
Yeah.
then it helps shape the way that you think about these other things that are in adjacent or broader lanes. But it's a real big leap to do that, right? It's a real big leap in comfort, and it's a real big leap in skill.
Yeah, and I think, so I have not been always good at this. I mean, I was really bad at this when I first tried to do it. The first interaction I had with a reporter was a New York Times reporter. So I pick up the phone when the New York Times reporter called me because it's the New York Times, and like even I think that that's impressive. And this is before I'd really done anything, and the conversation is terrible, where I'm like, actually, it's more complicated. Actually, it's more nuanced. You're asking the wrong. It was 45 minutes, and I was like, I did a great job. I really taught this guy. And what they wanted to write, and he told me starting off, I want to write a cultural literacy piece about hijab. We're going to do these little like nuggets, 700 words about all these different religious things, and they're going to be cultural literacy pieces. And I was like, okay. And so he's like, he already knows what he wants to write, right? And so what he wants to write is there are 5 types of Muslim women. You can tell who they are based on what they wear. That's basically what he wants to write. And I'm like, he's like, what do they wear in Iran? I was like, who, where, when? Like, what do you mean, like, what do they wear in Iran? This is not like, so I was really, anyway, I did terribly with him. I thought I did great. I was like, I taught him all kinds of stuff in 45 minutes. The piece came out. I'm not quoted in it, thank God, because the piece is terrible. He did exactly what he wanted to do, and I wasn't very helpful to him, so I'm not in the piece. But I I came out of that feeling guilty that I'd missed an opportunity. Because it's the New York Times writing 700 words about something I know a lot about. Certainly I could have shaped that conversation. So all my editor and journalist friends will now tell me, no, that reporter messed up, but like, okay, but I'm not responsible for that reporter, right? Like maybe they weren't asking the right questions, but I can certainly guide this conversation if and now I could be like, no, this is the piece you want to write. Please don't put, you can Google this piece. It's like 2017, 2018, New York Times. It's like black outlines of different Muslim women, stick figures, and it's basically like, this is what a burqa is, and these women believe. I mean, it's just really terrible.
Yeah, I think I remember it.
Yeah, it's really bad. I'm not, and everyone I knew on social media posted it, and I was like, that's like kind of my fault, right? So I was really, really bad at it. So I just spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do it, basically.
So,
now.
But at Northeastern, I imagine that you also didn't have a group that was telling you, this is how you go out and do public scholarship.
Yeah.
Or
so,
did you?
Northeastern's a different institution than the University of Chicago in that as soon as I got there, like they love, we have a huge, I think our marketing communications machine is like quite sophisticated, and they are delighted if you have anything and push it out into the world. But when I said, look, I messed up with the New York Times, and now this book is coming out, and I'm getting all these like requests, and I was like, can you give me training? And they were like, we don't do that. And who else is doing this? Like, I need some friends to like call on to be like, how do I do this better? And they're like, I mean, this is not what we do. We are the communications department of the university. So whether that's for what the president wants or what the strategic plan wants or whatever, but not about capacity training for different scholars. And I was like, I need training. Like, I can figure out how to do something, but I don't know how to do this now. I haven't done this for most of my career. So I realized that I needed like capacity building skills, and I needed a group of people because I needed to be able to, and basically needed to call on people when things went sideways and to know how to deal with them. Because like if someone comes, I was recently quoted in a New York Times piece, and I got a lot of blowback. Nothing that I said, it was just a piece about Muslim women, so I always get blowback. And I know now to shut down my social media. It's not a big deal. But I had to learn that, right? Like, and I wasn't on social media. I had to learn how to be on social media in a way that didn't get me in trouble. So I needed a community. I needed some training. And I also, the other thing that I think I really needed, and I continuously do, is there's this like, it's like this coffee date with yourself, which is like, again, it's like, why did I come to Swift Hall? Why did I study religion? How is that going to guide the kind of public scholarship I want to do? So it's like a mission statement almost for like, what things do I care about? What things do I want to put my time into? And so those three things I didn't have, and those are three things I put the most time into going forward.
And it seems like if you don't have that, then the landmines are pretty significant. I remember when I first started at USC, it was right when the sexual abuse crisis was going on, which the Catholic Church in Los Angeles was very implicated in. And the New York Times, every major outlet that you ever wanted to talk to would call weekly. And my boss at the time said, we have nothing to add to that conversation. We just don't. So we're not going to do it. And I thought it was a really profound lesson because there were so many people who chased headlines. Yeah. And in chasing headlines, they created liabilities for themselves. They also created a sort of brand about themselves, right? So there's a set of incentives to do it. But there's also some real liabilities in that.
Yeah, that's a really smart lesson to get early on because I think that it's, think of it less as chasing headlines, but like how many times can I get cited? Oh, my university loves it if I get cited in pieces. Can I like get my like list up? And so every time someone calls, do I like want to, get sure I get quoted in there? But then you end up like, are you telling them? So back up a little bit. One thing I did early on to like figure out how to do this was I co-taught a class with a journalism professor at Northeastern. And I learned a lot about how journalists see scholars during this process because she referred to us, scholars of religion, to her students, her journalism students, as big brains. So they were writing an enterprise story. They already knew what they were going to write about. They already know who they're interviewing. But you got to get a big brain because you got to get a quote that says the thing that backs up the thing that you're saying, right? And so I don't want to be that person. I don't want to like get a call to write a quote to confirm what the journalists thought they already figured out based on whatever, their impressions of what was going on in the situation. But if you are good at that, you'll get called a lot and you'll get quoted a lot, right? But like you're saying, you're not adding anything to the conversation. So that's sort of like, in terms of my like mission statement, there's like, am I like the right person? Like, do they need my voice in this conversation? Like, if not, like you don't want to talk to me. Talk to these people instead, or, you know, or can we shape the story a little bit? But I think it's so like fast, and in some ways it's a lot more gratifying than like writing a peer-reviewed article that you wait for, or waiting for your book to finally get done. You can get like a lot of stuff out there and placed or quoted, but I think there is that risk of being like, you know, what is the reason you're doing this? Are you being a public educator, or are you just trying to like promote, I don't know what it is. Is it promoting a brand? Is it just like, I mean, again, I'm not in this for the fame. There's not any money in it. So really, if it's not about teaching in public, then there's not really any reason to do it, I think.
So you built Sacred Rights. So talk about what that was, because ultimately Sacred Rights is sort of like the project that you needed to translate you into
That's
the
exactly
public square.
What it is. I was like, it wouldn't exist. I was really annoyed it didn't exist. I couldn't find it anywhere. I did every training I could out there. And then I like just basically created what I wish I'd had. So it does start first before we have a large loose grant now, but it started with this little pilot thing from the ACLS, and that was me co-teaching this class, and it was a way to like kind of trick Northeastern to letting us co-teach a class between units, because that's financially complicated at my institution. It was a little bit to trick a journalism professor into taking religion seriously, because we have this problem at Northeastern where all the journalists will like call me at the end of the term when their papers are due and want me to teach them what Islam is, like in an hour conversation. They don't take our classes. And it's super frustrating, right? I'm like, I can't do that. And also like come take a class if you care about these, you know, let me like get you to be asking better questions. So it was a way to get those students to pay attention to religion. And we did a reporting trip in Granada, so I took them to Granada, so I got people to come. But again, in that process, I like learned a lot about, frankly, the culture of journalism and media. And then did some convening around with like journalists on one side of the table, academics on the other side of the table, and what they like thought about each other, which was so eye-opening. I mean, I think my co-teacher and I joked that we kind of had this weird sibling rivalry thing. It feels very much like me and my middle sister. My middle sister is like really cool. She lives in Lake Tahoe. She like, you know, she was always cool in high school, had lots of friends. And I'm like the older nerdy sister who like went to Harvard University Chicago. And so like I'm the big brain, and like she's the cool like journalist. And like I'm like, the journalists are so cool. I wish I could be cool like them. And they're like, you guys think that we're dumb because we're just journalists. And I'm like, no, I think you're so cool. I want to play. So we just had this like weird dynamic. Like we didn't understand where we were coming from. So like thinking about that, the first thing that happened before building Sacred Rights was out of that project I co-wrote 3 pieces with a young freelance journalist who had done pieces for Teen Vogue. And again, figuring out what do I need to learn how to do? And here's a mentor. Here's like a 23-year-old mentor who's going to mentor me through the process of pitching and writing and editing and dealing with editors and learning that culture. And then after that is really where the Sacred Rights piece came. So, and Sacred Rights basically does, again, what I wish I had. It's the training piece, which has really evolved over the last couple of years. We're just doing this super intense restructuring and revision of it, making its anti-racist sort of intentions much more central. But the training does the 3 things I said I needed, which it does like capacity building, like learn how to write op-ed. Now you have to write an op-ed. Learn what social media is. Try it out. Like play with live work. What does it mean to say on core message on camera? What is it? So all these like skills I needed to learn, and try out which one do you feel comfortable in. What's an explainer? How do you pitch? How do you like work with journalists? How do you build relationships? How do you make sure that they, you know, don't not want to work with you again, which is another thing. We are like really have a reputation for being difficult scholars. So if you're not difficult, you can really work with a journalist or editor for a long time. So that was a piece of it, the capacity building. A big piece of it was that like coffee date with yourself stuff, like why do you want to do public scholarship? What are your personal responsibilities in this space? Who are the communities that you care about? What risk are you willing to take on? And then the last part is cohort building. So all of our trainings are done on a cohort model, and people have to like work together throughout the whole thing, because the idea is to have at the end people that will signal boost your work and be your cheerleader and be a sounding board, because it's way less risky and way more fun, I think, if you can do it with a cohort of people who've gone through it, and they kind of know no, you can write about that. Like that's, that's totally your expertise. You can, or here's how I would frame it. This is what I see you in this conversation, kind of be a sounding board. So that's a big piece of it. And the other piece of it, because I learned so much from this co-writing experience with this Teen Vogue freelancer, is we set up media partnerships. And the idea of that was to incentivize people who don't cover religion to cover more religion. So the best example of that is Bitch Media, which if it's not an outlet but it's not an outlet that covers religion. Mm-hmm. And for 3 years, I talked to the editor and the managing editors being like, you can pick the scholars. I'll give you scholars. I'll pay the scholars. But we think that there's some stuff here you guys could be publishing. And some of my favorite pieces came out of that partnership. Mm-hmm. So an ethicist who works also in rabbinics, Rebecca Epstein-Levy, who's now at Vanderbilt, I think, wrote a piece about risk in the rabbinics and how you think about risk much differently than the purity culture, and it shifted the way I thought about COVID and contagion and risk. And I teach it all the time in my classes now, and that is it's something that Bitch Media would never have done. And Rebecca was like, I can't write my stuff is rabbinic, so I'm like, no, she figured out how to have that. So she learned, she got mentored. So we set up a bunch of those kind of partnerships too, where we could pay scholars for their time and their expertise, but then also get them in this kind of mentoring relationship. The ones that's going on now, and also an alum, Elizabeth Palmer, who's at the Christian Century, is doing one right now where she has a couple scholars writing for her. And then they get content they wouldn't have gotten, the outlet, and the scholar gets this amazing experience. So.
But there are a lot of media training programs for scholars, right?
I couldn't find it. I'm sure there are some.
There are lots of, every foundation will sometime make an attempt to capture the knowledge in the academy and translate it out into the world. Yeah. But your stuff is specific to religion. Yeah. And your story about that goes back to religion being in the room in your earliest days. And then also being the sort of impetus for that in 2016. So what's the religion-related stuff that is different in what you do than in something else, right? Why does it matter that sacred rights is for people who do religion?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I've been pushed, or I've been encouraged by some people to expand what we're doing to humanities in general. We really need, get the Mellon Foundation involved. And I've done some of this. I went to Carleton and did some public scholarship training with just their humanities center, for example. I guess that was before COVID. That's not that long. So it's a long time ago now. That was the last event I did before COVID. So it was that and then this. So 3 years between them or something. But I think again, this is why did I decide to be a scholar of religious studies? What did I learn here? Religion's always in the room. I think that what's true at the University of Chicago, or what is true here that I was taught, is that it's so integrated in culture and politics and society. And I am concerned that people who spend a lot of time thinking thoughtfully about it are not part of the public conversations about it, not helping. And I don't want to lead the conversation, but I want to be able to give some concepts and frameworks to that conversation. And if we're not part of it, the void is filled. It's not right. Conversation. The conversation is going to happen, and the people who are going to lead it may not be thinking as capaciously as we do. Right now I'm interested in public scholarship in the humanities more broadly, but I just think we're at a moment where religious studies scholar, at least I am personally felt as a religious studies scholar, called to be more public facing with my work, whatever that means. If that means that, again, maybe all it means is that I write a book for University Press, and then I think about where I will do book conversations, or where I'll do lectures in a different way. Maybe I'm not just going to come in and do university. Maybe I'll meet at the bookstore, at the local synagogue, or the local library or something, thinking about, or maybe I'll try to get my mom's book club to do it again, her church or something, or maybe I'll go into K through 12. So it can just be that. But for me, it just we're just at this moment where it's, if you don't, everyone sort of, I think, is starting to understand that it's always in the room. That's Liz Kinnicky, quote one of our media partners who used to produce a show for CBS on religion. And I want that conversation to be, nuance isn't the right word. I just want it to be as thick as it can be, right? I want it to have, I want it to really benefit. For me, it's not usually my voice. I'm usually working with communities, and so I'm like trying to like bring their perspective in the conversation. But like I guess I feel like just like I think it was important when I was here, I think it continues to be important, and now it feels important to me in terms of my life and my kids' life and what's going on in the world and what's going on politically in a way that feels urgent, I guess. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah. So we've talked about the way that scholarship gets out into the world, but I wonder about the way that your engagements have changed the way that you think about not just how you think about your scholarship, but what you think about in your scholarship. So what are the ways that being in these conversations has actually had we've talked about it as a sort of outward process, right? You engaging in the world, but what changes about your even traditional scholarship as a result of being a public scholar?
Yeah, so like there's a lot of different levels of that. I think in the very beginning, what it meant was asking different questions of the material, like the data I was collecting, or the different ways I was collecting data, because I was thinking already about my audience, like who I was trying to reach. And again, I was trying to reach outside my classroom, maybe outside of the academy. I think it makes me think a lot more carefully about responsibility in this space again. I mean, I'm someone who like has written a lot about communities that I'm not part of. So what is my responsibility to those communities, I guess, in my work that I'm putting out in traditional scholarship or not? I think it's made my scholarship better. I think that my books progressively get better as traditional pieces of scholarship too, even if I'm trying to reach more of an audience. I think it makes me, so I'm someone who thinks through writing, right? So it makes me think more clearly to have to write more clearly. But I also think I'm not just stuck in my own head, like digging in the sand on this thing I'm finding interesting, because I'm now thinking already about what impact what engagement can have in the world. So it's making me be a little bit more, I don't know, intentional about the questions I'm asking and having them be more applied. I mean, I'm an ethicist, so I'm okay with constructive questions, but I think also like the beauty of being someone who is in constructive studies or interested in those questions is those are questions that are interesting to people and communities, and they come up in politics and society and culture all the time. But I'm letting those other people's questions help fuel what I'm looking for. Instead, I'm just like, oh, I'm super interested in this issue, that's like most of my scholarship. Oh, I was surprised by this weird thing, I'm going to write a book about it. Instead, being like, there's a problem or there's a challenge, let me see if I can like come at that in my scholarship. That's maybe external from me.
I also imagine though it puts you in conversation with all sorts of other canons that you wouldn't have known.
Oh
right?
yeah, absolutely.
So that the things that you take for granted, right? The things that you think of are as assumptions, they're entirely shifted by being part of a conversation that you wouldn't have been in the academy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think people hate social media, and I like didn't want to get on Twitter. I was one of those people that my editor like kind of ordered me on Twitter. She's like, you have a book coming out, we're going to do a big print run, like get on Twitter and meet some journalists. But I learned so much from Twitter. So like I probably learned more from like Black Twitter, particularly Black Muslim Twitter, than like in terms of like cultural criticism. That's conversations I don't see, but because I follow people, I mean, I wouldn't see in my academic spaces at a conference. It's not in traditional scholarships maybe, but because I'm like following a community, I can see this conversation happening, and that, I mean, this last book I wrote is suddenly, it's all about whiteness in a way that my work has not been before, and that's 100% because of the way in which going public has pushed those issues back into my work, 100%. Yeah.
What about the costs or liabilities associated with doing this? Both for you as a scholar and also for you just as a human, having to engage in a world where this kind of level of being public makes the world more hostile.
Yeah, so I should have answered that question when you asked me what was different about sacred rights as a media training, because that was something that was 100% missing from any of the trainings that I did, thinking about risk. And thinking about personal risk and professional risk. I mean, I think so something like the op-ed project, which I love, and I'm an alum ambassador, and I like help with the trainings, and I learned a lot about at least how to write an op-ed. They don't talk about what it means to write an op-ed and what the blowback is.
And the op-ed project was made to increase the number of women's voices in op-ed and editorial pages.
Yeah, that's right. And now they have, I mean, their mission has shifted, so they also are really interested in like like raising up voices of people of color, but they do have this sort of activist bent, and they do great training around op-eds. But the whole push is to like get you to say something in public, and they are sort of like, you know, stuff, the stuff that you know that matters. This is true for scholars too, right? But, or yes, but, you know, being, this is why I avoided it, right? Being public. So being like off the record, or not being on the record where they're journalists, you don't have control of your words. How their job is not to make you look good. I mean, it took me a long time to realize that like journalists and editors were not my friend. Their job was not to make me sound smart. Their job was to write their story, right? So knowing that relationship and being very careful. I'm not careful with my words. I am a rambler and a talker, and I talk fast and say a lot of things, but being careful when I talk to people. But also the risk, thinking about risk, when we're training people, thinking about risk, people have different levels of risk, like if they're a contingent or all AC, or if they're a scholar of color. If you're a woman online, forget about it. You should see my unsolicited DMs, or just, there's a lot of marriage proposals. I do not, you know, there's nothing about my profile that would, but there's, so like who you are shifts the risk that you have. So Anthea Butler, who's on our leadership team, on Sacred Rights leadership team, she and I were on a panel, something for the AR in the last year, and she said, you can worry about risk, but like you can't hide in your office anymore. Like they will come for you if you're, you know, if you're writing about things that matter and that people can understand and are a part of conversations, they will find you, and they will like, you know, troll you anyway. So being prepared for that is a lot of what we think about, at least with Sacred Rights, like understanding what information of yours is online, understanding, you know, my current book has stuff about the Hindu right on it. I'm gonna have to shut down probably my social media when it comes out, because there's nothing like the Hindu right troll is like, that apparatus is amazing. So I think being aware of it so you can make strategic questions. Like again, this last New York Times piece that I was quoted in, I didn't need to be quoted in that piece. I should have just said no, because I got so much more blowback, and it wasn't a conversation that I cared about. The piece is about balaclavas and how like little hipsters are wearing them now, and how this is, you know, same people who would say that a hijab is about women's oppression are like wearing something that's derivative of it. It's not something that I have a lot to say about. And I got a lot of blowback just because of the nature of the piece. Not like just blowback people who are just normal Islamophobic stuff. Yeah, so I think that thinking about the risk is important, and understanding your personal risk given your, like different subject matters are more risky if you write about white supremacy, all the alt-right, or you write about Hindu nationalism. Those are just risky subjects to write about because of what the blowback can be. Who you are, what your, you know, career position, and then also like, you know, how much information you have about your family online. Like we do a dox yourself exercise in Sacred Rights. Like you should know what's online about you, and if someone wants to, you know, what can they find your home address and stuff. And there's, you know, there's cheap software now you can scrub yourself. I subscribe to delete.com. That's $100 a year, so my stuff is scrubbed. But like I had to learn that. No one taught me that. It took me talking to people who'd had bad experiences and figuring out what are your strategies for avoiding it. What do you do when something happens? That's like it's an ongoing calculus. So like Anthea Butler would say, nothing's not risk. I mean, you can't avoid risk as a scholar anymore, because if like, I don't even know what those campus watch groups are anymore, but like if they find you and they want to do something with you, they'll do it with you. So getting yourself prepared, knowing what your institution has to support you, knowing like, again, what information is out there. It's just about mitigating that risk. I would rather put myself out there in the way that like I am intentionally doing it and I'm prepared for it versus waiting for them to come find me. So yeah.
Yeah, I had a conversation once with Marshall Gantz, who at Harvard, who was a well-known organizer and talks a lot about public narrative, and he said, everybody tells a story about you. It's just going to be the story you want or the story they want, depending on how much you're involved in it.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really useful. So for the people who are feeling a sense of urgency or call towards potentially opening up this area for them to engage in public scholarship, what advice do you give them as they begin?
So I think finding training, that for me was really key. So I think I didn't know what I wanted to do until I tried a bunch of things. So like the training is not to like learn how to do the one thing you want to do, but it's like to like to try out different things, right? So for example, because I talk really fast, and I do a lot, I thought radio is not going to be my thing, podcasts are not going to be my thing. I'm like not someone who can slow down. actually, I slow down on a podcast. Like podcasts and radio interviews are a really comfortable space for me. And I didn't know that till I learned how to do it. And I thought about core messaging. And I think about core messaging not the way that like a nonprofit thinks about it, like, but the way that a teacher thinks about it. Like, what's my learning objective for this radio interview, and how do I get us back on that message? Like, how do I come back? And what's the stories that I can tell from my research or whatever to get us back on there? So the training is partly to get exposure to things. I think, it doesn't have to be media engagement too. So again, thinking about what is it that integrates the different parts of me. Like, so I would say don't start a podcast because like everyone's starting a podcast right now. But if you're there, are you a visual person? Or if you're going to start a podcast, how is your podcast really different? Like, why do you have to do that podcast, right? Are you a visual person? Do you want to be on YouTube? Are you really like, no, I just like teaching's my thing. I want to be putting up these public access syllabi are so helpful. There's like, one of our alums did a Black Catholic syllabus that she puts up online. It's really helpful both for other college teachers, but then also through K through 12. So, I mean, we're doing some training for the AAR. The AAR often does training. There's things like the op-ed project if you want to try out stuff. And then I think too, trying to find a community. So if you had a community of people at the Div School, for example, either it was graduate students or faculty or whatever, who could like try out ideas together and support each other, I think that's super helpful. You can always follow Sacred Rights on Twitter. We do a lot of we push a lot of stuff out into the world too. But I think knowing that you don't have to look like, well, Anthea Butler's a great example. She's written a ton, lots of op-eds. She can write an op-ed in 2 hours. She is on TV. And I thought that's what public scholarship had to look like. And I also realized I can't do that. I don't ever want to be on TV. Like, TV is like not a space I'm not comfortable in. So realizing that there are alternative forms that fit up better with my skill set. And again, a lot of my stuff I do is behind the scenes. I don't need credit for it. I'm a full professor, what do I need it for? But if I can shape a story or put people in contact put someone else in contact with a reporter. So figuring out what's comfortable for you, I think, is a big part of it. Yeah.
So one way to do that is in September, the Marty Center, along with the Coleman program, is bringing Sacred Rights to graduate students who would like to go through a program. It'll be a tailored program just for Divinity School students. And so then application will go out shortly.
Yeah.
And you can apply to be part of one of 22 spots where you will get this intensive training and check in with yourself and learn how to do all of this work. And you'll, at the end of it, you'll have a written piece that is gotten editorial feedback and will be pitchable.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, you'll have a lot by the end of it. I mean, this is exactly, if I was thinking back now, what would have been the extra piece that would have gotten me to doing what I'm doing now, which is, again, I still do 90% of my writing is still very traditional. But like if I had this sort of training in grad school, it would have, I think, helped me integrate these different parts of myself a little faster. But the training is so, I'm super excited we're doing this, partly because I feel a lot of like warmth towards Swift Hall and Divinity School as a place that like is the reason for my career. But also because I think it'll be really great for cohort building within the graduate students too, right? But it's not just that we're gonna like have students like learn how to write an op-ed and write an op-ed or write an explainer and pitch an explainer and get feedback, editorial feedback, but also practice with like, doing live work and have a little video thing of them, like a little video clip of themselves, practice translating. This is great for the job market too, right? Like what is your expertise? How do you translate it? How do you broaden it? But then also so much of the program is like thinking about why you're here and why you care about it. It's a vocational question, right? Like, so you can find the space where you're not burnt out. Like I'm like not burnt out, right? Like you should be burnt out. Like you wouldn't believe how many hours a week I work. It's really stupid. It's really stupid. Like I'm not a model for how many hours of work to work. And I'm like working on an expert report for a law case I'm a part of on the way here, and then I have to pitch something and I have to give feedback to someone I'm doing. But like I love it all, and I love it all because I found this space where I could integrate, all those different pieces. And so a lot of the the conversation in the cohort in small groups and the training is about having those conversations with yourself early on, which I think just goes really great, like in parallel with the training that you're getting at Chicago. So I'm so excited about this. Can you tell I'm really excited about this?
Well, and I love that, to me, because that's the model of also what the Marty Center is, and it's based on who Marty was, which is, a deep scholar, someone committed to teaching, and someone who cared about communities, and that those three things existed in some kind of harmonious person, right? And not just in some way that is fragmented. I think is actually what creates a lot of generativity, right? If you don't have to spend all your time managing your fragmentation, then maybe it creates this own sort of propellingness, right?
Yeah, and I think too, not writing, looking over your shoulder. I think that was the first thing I learned when I started doing more, or any kind of public engagement, where you're not writing for a dissertation committee anymore, and maybe you're not only writing for the future outside reviewers of your tenure committee, whatever those, but you're you're writing what you know in a way that you think has impact, right, or matters for or if it's not writing, some other register, like it's community building or partnership building or whatever. That just makes for, for me at least, it's made for an academic life, which if they don't tell them this, but if they didn't pay me, I would still do at Northeastern, right? Like it's also like my hobby, and it's also whatever. It's the thing that, I would do if they don't pay me to do, but yeah.
Well, good. Let's turn to questions. What questions do you have? And we have a mic for those questions, not for the amplification, but for the online version of this. So it's in the corner somewhere. It's on stage behind me. I could have gotten it. So introduce yourself and provide your question to Liz, and she'll do her best to respond in the back.
Hi, thanks very much. That was excellent talk and good to connect more. Question I had is for master's students or early PhD folks. What's the balance to strike of trying to give energy to thinking publicly and being formed by that the whole course of your scholarship, while also not quite being at the place that you talked about of already having something serious ready to work from? How do you balance?
That's a good question. Probably different people would give you different advice about that. So I have personally always tried to keep my scholarship in such a way that I was flexible to move institutionally or move into different areas. And I think that's true for the balance of quote unquote traditional scholarship and public scholarship. So 80-20, 90-10, you kind of have to figure out the balance for yourself about so definitely people have, if you are on the job market for a tenure track job and you have a blog, but you don't have a peer-reviewed article, there'll be some grumpy person on the committee that will be well, you should have spent more time working on peer-reviewed articles, right? And you have to know that as some people don't like public scholarship and think that it detracts, or some people will be jealous of you doing that. So you don't want to give them reasons for that, right? So always, I think always when you're in grad school, the priority always has to be that sort of learning how to do and then practicing that craft of that traditional scholarship. But then if you write an article and you've gotten it published, you're maybe I want to write a piece for the conversation, because the conversation is a great outlet. That's a perfect outlet actually as an entry level. They want explainers. They want it research based. They do not want an article for USA Today, right? They want a piece that's linked to research. So maybe you write your peer-reviewed article and then you spend a week writing this explainer that then 90,000 people read in the first day and is taught in high school classes too. So it's not. So I like to double dip, right? So if you're, for me, it's I do this. And then sometimes I need a break from that, so now I'm going to step back and do some more public-facing work and sort of have the conversations out. But I certainly wouldn't encourage. The other thing about learning how to do this translation work is if you decide that you're doing an alt-ac or some other sort of career trajectory, then sort of. I'm not a good example for what that looks like because I've been at these research institutions. But it lets you try out communication skills in other sort of areas as well. So if I was in grad school now, I'd be doing both, right? I'd be okay, I think I had one peer-reviewed article when this is how long ago I graduated. I'm sure that's not adequate anymore. So I would be working on my peer-reviewed articles and practicing how to do that and finishing my dissertation. But then I might be like, every time when those things are done, I might then think about a way to do something that's public-facing, whether that it's being a guest on a podcast or a great entry-level thing for a grad student is being a guest host for like new book networks or something. Being a guest host on one of these podcasts that are already out there and trying it out and practicing it from the other side, like learning it as an interviewer, so you know what kind of works and what doesn't. Yeah. And then you have to be strategic and practical about it, though. That's what my advice would be.
Hello. So I guess I'm wondering, you talked a lot about public-facing scholarship, that's sort of pretty broad public. And I think particularly for us as scholars of religion, sometimes the public who's most interested in what we have to say is a specific religious tradition, potentially a tradition that we are already part of.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering a little bit how you think about potentially interfacing sort of publicly, but within a smaller sort of religious tradition versus bigger, the New York Times comes calling.
Yeah. So I think, I always say the New York Times, the Washington Post, because people tend to come to our training being like, I want to write for the Washington Post. And I'm always like, but why? Because are you just talking to people like yourself then? Like, that's who I'd be talking to if I'm talking to the Washington Post, right? There's something, if you're interested in writing an op-ed, writing something in a much smaller outlet can have a lot more impact, even just if you're staying in the op-ed thing, right? And I think that same is true for what you're saying. If you're interested in a particular community, it may be that you want to be doing educational outreach for them as a volunteer, right? Or like, do they need help writing things? It depends very much on the community that you are interested in, right? But that is just as important, if not more important, than the line in your CV that meant you wrote something for the Washington Post. We often have people when they start, if they want to write something, starting with, I have this like weird like boat, I have all these weird metaphors. So one of my metaphors is about boats and not like, so there's like the boat is the thing the topic that you want to write about, that you care about, but then there are like different docks that can go into, or different ports that can go into rather, and the ports are like the news hook or why it matters to people, and then the docks are like different outlets or venues. So like maybe you're like really interested in, I'm trying to think of an example, but like an issue that has to do with a particular religious community, and you're doing work like just with them, and then sometimes maybe you take a step back and you write something for an outlet that is, like religion news service is something that like gets religion. You don't have to explain religion when you're pitching religion news service. The editor at The Conversation who does religion and ethics is great. She like gets religion. Versus if you are trying to do one of these big outlets where like people aren't going to know even what you mean, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with starting with like, who is the audience you want to reach, and where are they, and what are they? If you're interested in writing, what are they reading? If you're interested in like more sort of hands-on, like what are the opportunities there for educational outreach, whatever, in that sort of smaller space, and starting with what they need, and where you see like, okay, that's where they are. Here's what I think I can add to the conversation. Yeah, it's like, it's totally different than sending in a peer-reviewed article, though. It just involves all this legwork, and then it'll be relationship building. Once you've done that once, that community will know you and trust you, and probably call on you again.
You mentioned not trying to dumb things down, but rather trying to make things more interesting. So what are some other mistakes or misconceptions that you think academics get into when they are like, you know what, I'm going to do something public? What are some pitfalls to avoid?
Well, I think, so people have been asking me a lot about, say they want to write a trade book, and I think they think that that's going to like pay for their kids' college. So I think there's this misunderstanding that doing more public scholarship is like more lucrative. It takes, or that it's quick. I have to say, writing an op-ed takes me an incredibly long time. The first op-ed I wrote took me 3 weeks, and then it didn't get placed because the Wall Street Journal asked me to write it, and I put a dig in about Trump at the end, and it was like not respecting their readership. It like didn't work for them. Like I just framed the whole thing the wrong way. So yeah, I think dumbing down is part of this like misperception. It doesn't always have to be. So some people are going to want to be working like towards policy and politics explicitly, but again, I don't think that has to be. I guess it's like this one-size-fits-all thing. Like it's not a one-size-fits-all. I guess that's a misperception. You really, for me, the public scholarship is figuring out for you how you're going to use the stuff that you know and figure out how it matters outside of the academy if that's something that you care about, because like it's just not fair that only our students get to like know what we, have the conversations that we're having. I think too, I think there's a misperception that sometimes public scholarship is like being at a podium and like telling people how it is. And I think that a better metaphor is a conversation that you're entering into, like sideways. There's probably a conversation already happening. So how are you entering in sideways as an interlocutor, like on the same level versus like the big, when I say the big brain, like that's not helpful to anybody.
It also seems like as a conversation is ongoing, that there's a lot of smarts in observing the conversation before you get into it, right? So
absolutely.
It's sort of like double Dutch, right? Where you watch the rhythm and then you figure out when the rope hits the ground, then you jump in.
Yeah.
And if you don't get that, then you'll get all twisted up.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of mistakes that happen are people not understanding that even if you're not part of the conversation is moving.
Yeah.
And so to observe it before, like any smart kid on a playground, right? You observe what's happening before you dive right in.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, that's mostly what I did when I got on Twitter for like 2 years. I just watched what was happening. And that's what journalists do on Twitter. They don't tweet. They just get on there and like lurk.
They lurk.
They just lurk. They're just like seeing, that's why they love you. They want to follow you because they want to see what kind of smart things you're putting out. And they want to follow like if you're a religion reporter, you're following, faith leaders, you're following academics, you're following NGOs. You want to see what the conversation is happening so you can like be writing articles about it. You want to get on there and lurk a little bit too. If it's not a social media space, whatever the other space it is, the conversation's happening, so that you know how to like. So this is a great lesson from the op-ed project. You don't want to be right, you want to be effective. So it doesn't matter if you're right in these. I mean, you should be right also, but like you need to come at people where they already are, so that you can contribute to the conversation really in a meaningful way. And I think the other thing that people, again, this idea that there's inherent risk in doing it, yet that is true, but like, again, there's no way to avoid risk by just not doing it, particularly if you're someone who works on something that's inherently risky, so better to get prepared for it when they come for you.
Thanks so much, this was so fascinating. So there are certainly PhDs who want to do public scholarship, but then there are also people who would like to not do academic work and imagine lives that are in public scholarship. And so one of my favorite journalists, Anne Helen Peterson, was a PhD. She had a tenure-track job that she left, worked for BuzzFeed, now is just an independent journalist.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what kind of skills, I mean, I love Anne Helen Peterson's work. It's different than someone who doesn't have a PhD, right? And so what is the kind of twist that having this kind of training could actually bring to a career where you're doing this for your life? Because, right, it's like, what happens when the big brain is also the cool kid?
Yeah. Whoa, look out.
Yeah, I know.
It's
That's
deadly.
like, that's a module.
That's my insert. Like that's that's the life goals right there.
Right.
Big brain and smart kid. I mean, so I follow and respect. Like, there are a lot of religion reporters and editors who are like part of my life now and part of my network who weren't a couple years ago. Who, I mean, they're amazing. Like their craft, their art is like something totally enviable to me. The way they can write and like quickly write and tell a story is just like, something like I want to do, like even in my like traditional work. I mean, I think that, you're sort of asking a question like what's valuable with a religious studies PhD outside of the academy, right, in some ways. And so, I mean, that has all kinds of ways of answering it, right? So like what people do who've had a master's degree or a PhD here is spend a lot of time understanding how to do basic research, how to understand traditions, a lot of really complicated frameworks and concepts and ways of like, again, if there's a conversation, see it in a different way. So when we did this co-taught class, the journalism professor and me, they all do these enterprise stories. And just something as simple as like, if you want to write a story about the gentrification that's turning the like local church into a condo, don't just talk to the local parish priest. Like, figure out other ways to come at religion without just going to that institutional thing. Because like even just the questions probably that that are getting asked and the way it's coming at like we all understand religion is so much more expansive. But so I guess it depends on what career we're talking. We're talking about journalism in general. I mean, so religion reporting is also not a field with like tons of jobs in it. Like that's like not like it's not like a better necessarily a more more secure job trajectory than the academy.
RNA was this last weekend, the Religion News Writers Association conference, and I don't think that people would come out of that thinking there's a tremendous amount of upward mobility in the religion reporting space as well, right?
Yeah, but that being said, a lot of people, so we have a lot of people who've gone through our training who are contingent scholars or alt-ac, who very easily translated their PhDs into different sort of, whether or not it's working for museum sort of curation stuff, so they're still doing this teaching part, or they're doing teaching internally for some sort of institution or corporation where like they're the ethics person, right, where they're like, or they're the religion person, they're doing that kind of work internally in some sort of small space. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question because I think we're in a moment of transition where if you're in graduate school now, the market was really different when I finished. And if I was coming out of graduate school now, I had been in NGO religion world before, so that was always my plan. That was always my backup plan. I was totally happy to go back and do that. So I think thinking about where else your expertise, the stuff that you're learning can matter, or the skills that you're learning, the techniques, not just the content, is like, again, that's like coffee date with yourself kind of conversation, like what do I see that, and I think those conversations are happening more and more at the AR. RNA, I mean, I usually go to the RNA, I didn't go this year. I mean, RNA is actually, the Religion News Association is also an interesting space to be having these conversations. But yeah, I don't have a good answer. I think it's like, we're in a moment of transition, right? Yeah.
This has all been super, super helpful. My question has to sort of connects what you were talking about liking to sort of think through your work as you're writing, taking 3 weeks to write an op-ed. A lot of part of what's made me anxious or like stay away from the public writing, even though I'm very interested in it, is this idea that there's kind of, that I've been told anyways, I could be very wrong here, but that you kind of have to ride the news cycle, that oftentimes these outlets want you to turn something around in 48 hours or something. And given especially the complexities of writing on religion in particular, aside from other public topics, how do you navigate that, being responsible, just sort of bringing all of these ideas we've been talking about to this condensed time frame?
So that the response to the news cycle is no joke, right? Mm-hmm. Like learning how to do that is like, so that does get easier, right? So as you write your first piece about Orientalism and you know how, like the first time I wrote a piece, one of the I think it's one of the co-written pieces, I had to like condense all of like colonialism or something into like 2 sentences. So I spent like a week writing this one like paragraph kind of thing, and now I'm like, all right, I know how I talk about that. Because like trying to think about like what is it that I need them to know to get this next point, that takes a lot of time and gets better with practice. But there's a couple things. I mean, one is I actually rarely do things that people ask me to do on a quick timeline because, again, if you knew how many hours I was already working, you wouldn't, not a good model for this at all. But sometimes I do, and when I do, it's because I'm like, I have some sort of outrage about a situation, like I'm having a reaction already, and so it actually gets it out of my system faster. Rebecca Epstein-Levy is a good example. This woman I spoke about before who wrote for Bitch Media, she's like, I don't know how to, we were trying to talk about op-eds and pitch op-eds, and she couldn't come up with an idea. And then as we were talking, I was like, I think you're reactive. Like you, no offense, but I think you, I don't mean this is a bad thing, you are gonna respond. When something happens, you get pissed off, that's when you can write the op-ed. So some people, the news cycle actually is really generative. Right. This is not the right conversation. So the one time I did do this was when when they were talking about removing the hat ban from the congressional floor, and all the conversations in order to allow hijabs to be on the congressional floor when when Ilhan Omar was coming on as a congresswoman, and I was like, this is like not the right conversation. Why is the liberal left equating a hijab with a hat? This is like not a hat. This is like not a hat. Why are we talking about the hat? Like this is like, so I was getting like really annoyed by the way it was being discussed in all the different outlets I was reading that I like pitch something just to get it out of my system. That's one of the few times I've done something reactive. That being said, you can kind of like game the news cycle. So like I have this book coming out. I have a chapter about solidarity hijab, like when you put on a hijab to like stop gender Islamophobia and all you do is reinforce gender Islamophobia. So like I know World Hijab Day, which is like a thing, is gonna be a news hook for me. So I'm gonna like plan to pitch something and write something for that. Religious holidays, they always need something about Islam on Ramadan. So like I did a piece for Ramadan about an organization that raises bail money to get believers
bailout.
Believers bail out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that organization actually approached me saying, how can we, like, can you like help us get something into Teen Vogue? I was like, I don't know if I can get you into Teen Vogue, but I can get into Teen Vogue about your organization. So like I pitched something that we really cared about. It was a really interesting way to teach about zakat, for example, and to show this interesting mass incarceration, social justice thing happening in the Muslim community, and like Teen Vogue wanted it because it was Ramadan. So like you have all these religious holidays, they're always looking for like, and then you pitch a story that's interesting and important for public literacy, and that's to, I don't usually say public literacy because I think it's much more than that. Like about you shifting the conversation around these things. So you can kind of like plan things out. Like there's something called International Yoga Day, World Yoga Day. So I'm gonna like have a piece ready about, you know, alt-right, wellness culture, Hindu nationalism, based on this last book I wrote for when that comes around next year. So you can kind of plan out some of this stuff. I wrote a piece about the Met Gala, the heavenly bodies, the Catholic, and I wrote it too late. I didn't get there until like it was about to close down, and I was like, whoa, this is like, I hate this for so many reasons. And I wrote something that did get published, but it got published in Religion Dispatches because Evan was like, this is like too well written not for me to publish, but like you did miss the news cycle, right? Like if I had written it earlier, I could have thought more carefully about who do I want to reach with this, and I could have pitched it. So like you lose your flexibility if you can't hit the news cycle. But like that was just me being like, yeah, I'm not gonna go this, I'm not gonna go this, I'm not gonna go this, I'm not gonna go this. Okay, I'm gonna go this. Okay, now I have like lots of feelings and lots of thoughts about it. So you can
I
plan
wrote
it out.
one of my op-eds on my phone on a plane one time because I was so angry.
Yeah,
about
anger is a
something.
good, yeah.
So
More
I was a
outrage
rage
works.
writer
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that. But the other thing I wanted to add to this is that you can also game the news hook by writing the story that you want, and then having the news hook for when it, like just adding the news hook into it. So I wrote an op-ed in the LA Times with Rebecca Sager at Loyola Marymount, and we wanted to write about the way that people were talking about how the nuns were going to sort of save politics. And which I don't think is going to happen. The religious nuns, the people who are unaffiliated, and so we wrote about that.
N-O-N-E-S. I went right to like nuns in a habit. Not nuns.
Those nuns, not the other nuns. And so, we wrote this piece about it, and we ended up using a Franklin Graham event to talk about how it's called the Evangelical Church is Getting Leaner and Arguably Meaner. And so we framed our story well before the Franklin Graham event happened. We just knew that there was something, there's always going to be something.
Figure out what you want to
So
say,
what you want to say.
And then wait.
Right?
And just like sit there like, and it's gonna happen. Are you kidding? I could write a piece about hijab, blah, blah, blah. Like, I mean, something's gonna happen, right? France is gonna do something. Someone's gonna do something. I could have a piece about hijab in France like every month. You just wait, and then you're ready to pounce. So that's sort of like writing my boat metaphor, which doesn't really work, I guess. But like, what are the topics that you care about going public with? And then you can sort of like.
Then you find the tide.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with a peer-reviewed article in some ways, right? You can write an argument and then figure out how it joins. There's a conversation happening already in the jar about this issue. So how do you hook into that conversation? How do you frame it? Even if your actual argument in the core of it is, and then how you take that argument and translate it to, I mean, this is my double dipping in the traditional scholarship too. How do you think about something and then have an argument that you then want to translate to different sort of like academic journals, and you can do the same thing. You can't write the same piece, but you can like, if your intervention is this thing, or this is the way you want to shift the conversation. Because even though if you said it before, they haven't read it before, right? You don't realize how much public teaching there is to do on religion, right? One of my favorite pieces by Simran, who's at Religion News Service, who's on our board as well. He wrote a piece about Orientalism. It's like 101 Orientalism. It's framed around him going through TSA and having his turban removed or messed with by TS in front of his daughter, his young daughter. And he was like, I don't know, this is like so simple. Like, like the readership of Religion News Service, who all care about religion, doesn't understand the way that Orientalism feeds into this, particular moment of being a religious minority in the US, for example, right? It's a really important piece for that readership, even if it seems 101. So yeah, I think game the system. I'm a planner, so I'm gonna have my list of topics ready to go, and then just wait for something to blow up.
Well, thank you. Thank you. In
Yeah,
particular, thank you all for enduring the challenges of this room today.
The radiators are amazing.
Only a conversation this interesting could survive that. So thank you very much. And if you were interested in joining Sacred Rites, that will be here in September, look for an email from, I think, the Dean of Students office, which will make the application available to you or to your students. If you have grad students who'd be interested in doing that, or even teaching fellows as well.
Oh yeah? Oh,
Yeah.
Good. I had a question about that, so good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
Liz. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.